Welcome to What's a Beautiful Life Anyway? I'm your host, Jill Bennett. This is the channel that shares ideas to help you live your best life, because life can be beautiful if you live consciously. Welcome to episode 46 of What's a Beautiful Life Anyway? To live our best and most beautiful life, we all want to be healthy and happy. And for many people, being happy is often linked to the number on the scales. Can you relate? I know I can. Today, my guest is Karen from Nutrition by Karen, who can help you understand how your body, metabolism, and microbiome impact your mind and food choices, so you can make improvements with dramatic effect. Karen's expertise is hormones, and in this mini-series, we'll explore how hormones drive how we feel. Welcome, Karen.
Hi, thank you for having me, Jill.
Oh, it's so lovely to have you here. It's we met at a conference, didn't we, in Liverpool, of all places. Yes. and we hit it off straight away. And when Karen was talking about what she did, I thought, you know what? I've got to get this lady on, because there's so many things that affect us, or so many hormones that affect our whole lives. And it's really good to learn more about it. This is going to be part 1 of 3, where we cover 3 really important hormones. And today we're going to do a general background. So Karen, tell us about you and how you got started, how you got where you are today.
Well, so we all have a story. I'm 49 now, so I'm in that perimenopause stage, and I have a clinic in Gibraltar, and I call myself a holistic nutritionist, and I'm a coach. So it's not all about the food, it's also about helping people to understand the mindset. But in order to do this, we also need to understand the drivers in the body. And the reason I sit here today, it's like my whole life's work is what I present to people, because I've struggled actually my whole life with my weight and my hormones. And what I mean by hormones is it's not just the reproductive hormones, and we're going to talk about this in a bit, but it's understanding that cycle of hormones, which led me to, my mood to change, which led to my eating behaviors changing, which led to disordered eating, actually, if I'm very honest. And, I went to doctors, I went to nutritionists, and I never got the answers that I needed. And, so by age 40, I thought, you know what, I need to do this myself. And I started then, what has turned into 9 years of research, of understanding what are hormones, what are the hormones that affect me, how do I make sense of it all? Because a lot of the information out there is very scientific, and that doesn't make sense to the layman. And sometimes we just need some simple answers, not, complicated pathways. So really, the reason I do what I do is to share the knowledge in simple ways that I've had to learn myself.
Brilliant. And I think with so many ladies that I've interviewed, they all have that story that led them to do what they do, because sometimes something that someone else does isn't right for you. You need to tweak it. You need to find what works for you. So it's brilliant that you're here with us today. And I know exactly what you mean. The whole disorder. I think I'm still a bit of a disordered eater. I can go hours and hours, and my family are always telling me, for goodness sake, you haven't eaten today, but sometimes I don't feel hungry and I don't eat. And so, yeah, I'm sure it's not good for me, but I'm one of those people. Okay, brilliant. So I think we need to know, first of all, what are the 3 most important or influential hormones in our bodies?
So when it comes to health, and obviously this is always the number 1 driver in everything. So if we put weight aside for 1 minute, weight or fat gain is a form of inflammation. And all disease and all health problems and all hormonal imbalances start with inflammation. So when all of our hormones are lined up like a row of dominoes, we have about 50 different hormones in the body. And, I don't know if your audience even knows how a hormone works, but essentially we have hormone receptors all around our body. And in the blood, then we need to make hormones which are transported in the blood. And then those hormones go around and meet up with their various receptors. So hormones very much work like a voice, which is the hormone, and an ear, which is the receptor. And they need to connect to hear the message to drive the function. So, so there's a lot of organs at play here, but essentially, in terms of hierarchy of hormones, if all the hormones are lined up like a row of dominoes, and this is our hunger hormone, and whether we're tired, whether we can sleep, our mood hormones, all of these, the main drivers affecting all of the hormones is two key ones: insulin and cortisol. Insulin is linked to our blood sugar, and I think we're going to talk a bit about that today. And cortisol, which is our stress hormone, but is also linked to our emotional stability, how safe and secure we feel in our own skin. These two are the main drivers. So if these are at the top of the scale of the row of dominoes that are our hormones, once those two are out of balance, everything else can go off. So really, the kind of work that I do in this holistic nutrition is trying to get to the root cause all the time. Where do we start? When we're trying to talk about balancing certain hormones, it's like you can't start at the back end. You have to start right at the beginning.
Yeah. I think that another big thing there is people don't realize how everything is affected in their body. As you say, it's all linked. If someone has a headache, they think they need a headache tablet, but they're not linking that to the gut, to the cortisol levels, to the insulin levels. It is amazing how people don't put two and two together and realize how holistic the body is and how one function affects something else. Okay, well, yeah, we'll focus on insulin today, but the most influential hormones, would you say that's for women generally, or is that covering men too? I guess with those two especially, it's covering men as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, this is another one of the messages that I'm trying to get out there is we are all humans and all humans have, all of these hormones that affect our sleep, our strength, our mood, our hunger, and our health. The differences then between men and women is, us women have a monthly hormone roller coaster, which men don't have. So that's really, it's the reproductive hormones that separate us slightly. But in terms of managing inflammation, managing mood, managing weight, managing strength, the human hormones are the same for men and women. And I have, when I first started out, most of my clients are women, and now I have a complete mix. I have it's 50-50, and I do a lot of couples packages as well, actually.
Yeah.
So I have a lot of men and women. So I think men are starting to realize as well that testosterone matters, and we'll talk about this when we talk about estrogen, because all of these hormones are linked. And one of the things that you just mentioned about linking things together, I think if there's one thing that people can take away always is linking up these different systems in the body and just trying to be curious enough to go away and do your own research so that you can understand what is driving you, because we're so individual. And, when we show up at the doctors to say, can you tell me what's wrong with me? The truth is they don't know. They're just going to ask you about what your symptoms are. And if we get to know our own symptoms of, imbalance in the body, then we can very much take control of our own health. That's my belief.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I believe with doctors, you're right, they ask the symptoms, and then in most cases they treat the symptoms.
Yeah, and this is a disaster on so many levels. And every time that I see a client here in my clinic, it reinforces me that I need to keep doing this work that I'm doing, because when you take medication, doctors are amazing people. I work with many, and a lot of them go into their careers because they're good people who want to rescue people, but they are trained by a system which is often funded by pharmaceuticals. So they're training you up to sell their medications, which is a bit sinister, but absolutely true. And, if the example of the headache, if you have a headache and you take a headache tablet, that headache tablet is going to block a pathway. So you don't feel the headache, but it doesn't take the headache away. It doesn't take the cause of the headache away. And if you're not listening to your body in terms of what is causing that headache in the first place, it will shout louder. It will say, you're not listening to me, and it will shout louder. And what's the doctor's response then? To raise your medication.
Yeah.
And this is what happens. Medications raise, so the body becomes a little bit resistant. But also what happens is that headache pathway, if it's blocked, the body will just say, okay, she's not listening to me through this pathway. I'm going to find another pathway, and another symptom will show up in the body, which again will be treated with medication. So again, and before you know it, you've got 15 different conditions, 15 different medications, and yet the root cause is still the same.
Yeah. It's incredible how many doctors I've interviewed, both on this podcast and when I was doing radio in the UK, and they were all breaking away from the NHS and setting up more holistic practices, because some of them are embarrassed, but it's not their fault. It's the way they're taught. It's the way the medical profession is always taught. But it really needs a big shake-up so that they consider more holistic things. You get more and more now who will consider diet. I mean, Dr. Chatterjee, he's very good at going and talking to other doctors and saying, don't just treat depression with a tablet. That's the worst thing you can do. You've got to actually talk to the person, look at their diet, look at their mobile phone use just before they go to bed. All this sort of thing can have such a huge dramatic difference on someone. So it's a scary world we live in. It is a scary world we live in.
And it is the way to go. And I read something the other day that we're talking about this biohacking, or this kind of scientific nutrition that we're working on now, which is understanding the human biology, the human chemistry. I think that this will explode in the same way that internet did, because it's relevant to each and every one of us. And when you start jumping on board with it, you notice the changes in yourself. There's no going back. It is the way, the truth, the light. And, it's so healing.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right there. Fascinating, Karen. I think before we explore some of these hormones in more detail, can you just explain the women's cycle to us? So we literally go from being children to having a fertile stage to a perimenopausal and then a menopause stage. So to help people understand a little bit more about how our hormones are affecting all this, can you just give us a little bit of an insight into all of that, please?
Yeah, sure. So us women are going through constant hormonal change, from children basically to when we get to around age 9. Actually, I've got my little charts here available, which might be helpful. But I always say, in order to understand menopause, we need to understand what happens in puberty. And of course, what happens in puberty is, when the body gets to that age where it's ready to start reproducing, which can be as young as 9 years old, which is always so fascinating. And actually, interestingly, because of diet and lifestyle, the age is becoming lower and lower, interestingly. But
just to interject there, you're absolutely right. And when you actually investigate that, it's often to do with the hormones in milk. because the hormones are given to the cows, it's in the milk people drink, they pee it out. And it's something that when you're going through the process of cleaning water, the hormones can't be taken out. So this is what a GP told me once. So children are going through puberty so much younger, which is a little bit scary, really.
Yeah, it is scary. I mean, yeah, we could do a whole nother podcast on food quality and estrogenic food, which is really changing the human biology on a collective level. So it is quite frightening, really. Yeah, so going back to this chart, we have kind of three reproductive hormones. We have estrogen, testosterone, and progesterone. And what is happening in those puberty years with a girl is she starts to produce a lot more estrogen. And one of estrogen's jobs is to stimulate the follicle stimulating hormone to release an egg. But when the body's never done that before, estrogen is released kind of en masse. And so you get this kind of surge of estrogen. Again, it's like estrogen shouting at the body, release the egg, release the egg, release the egg. So you get this massive rise in estrogen. And estrogen is a hormone that it affects our insulin and blood sugar. It affects our serotonin levels, which is our mood stabilizing hormone. And it can make us feel actually quite hyper. And so when we get these massive hormonal surges without getting the progesterone that comes only after we have ovulated, we get this hormonal imbalance. So we get something called estrogen dominance, which is when we're very dominated with estrogen, and that really messes with our mood. Estrogen, I mean, we'll talk about this more when we talk about estrogen in particular, but just to give you an idea, it affects our water balance, it affects our sugar balance, it affects so many things in the body, and it's a great hormone when it's in balance. But when it's out of balance, it wreaks havoc, and that's why we can't control our mood, and we can be very teary and very irritable and just ready to explode. What happens when we finally get that ovulation is we start to produce this hormone progesterone. And progesterone is a hormone that acts slightly different to estrogen. Actually, progesterone's much more of a calming hormone. It can help us sleep. It clings on to water, whereas estrogen lets it go. And it's very important that we get our progesterone balance right too. And that is very much influenced in the way that we eat. So this is kind of what happens when we're going through puberty. And then obviously once we start our period cycle, we are having this roller coaster all the time of the estrogen coming up and coming down and coming up and going down. And then this progesterone run, which only comes up after you've ovulated. And if your cycle then is out of balance, we don't get these hormones in balance. So it's very complicated. What happens then as we start going through on the later stages of life, as we start going through menopause, is the body recognizes that our reproductive years are coming to an end, and so those eggs are starting to run out. And so it's the opposite. So what happens is we stop ovulating, so we stop producing progesterone, but as a result, the body is still producing estrogen because it's still doing the job that it's been doing since you were age 9. And, again, this is where estrogen can really come up. Because it will be delivering that message to the body saying, come on, you haven't released an egg. You need to release an egg. That my normal level of estrogen is not working. Let me release some more. And so they call this menopause like a second puberty, because again, you can get this enormous estrogen dominance until it recognizes this isn't working anymore and it stops shouting. So if you can imagine this estrogen like the voice coming up and shouting louder and louder and louder. And then eventually, when the receptor is not getting the message, the estrogen will just say, okay, this isn't working, and it will just stop. So then you get plummeting estrogen, which has another load of symptoms, and again affects the way that you feel and your skin quality and your skin and your mood and your food and and all the rest of it. So yeah, it's not easy. And of course, what happens then when you don't ovulate, you don't get progesterone anymore, so you don't get this lovely calming hormone that helps you sleep. And so we get estrogen dominance, where we can be ratty and irritable and unable to sleep. And yeah, so that's that's as short and sweet as I can get it. We can go off on so many different tangents.
Yeah. Oh my God. So yeah, it's there's a lot going on in the body at different times of the month. And so I guess that's why so many people, both perimenopausal and when they've gone through the menopause, have that difficulty sleeping.
Yeah.
I never realized that was what happened. I mean, I'm terrible sometimes at sleeping. It goes in fits and starts, but sometimes I really have a bad time trying to sleep. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, and so that's a lack of progesterone. And I think, in the medical industry, the doctors that are giving HRT, there's a lot of emphasis on estrogen, and people are playing around with estrogen, but there's not many doctors who are prescribing progesterone actually. And sometimes, sometimes we need both.
Yeah.
You can still have estrogen dominance, where estrogen is where your progesterone is very low, but you can still have estrogen dominance even though your estrogen levels are lower than they used to be. So you can still have estrogen but plummeting progesterone, so you've still got lowered hormones, but you still have estrogen dominance because it's still higher than the progesterone.
And I know we'll touch on this in another episode, but are there foods you can eat for both estrogen and I can't even say progesterone? I find that one really hard to say, but are there things you can eat for both? I know there are for estrogen. Are there for progesterone?
Yeah, so one of the things I always get my people to do is seed cycling is one of the easiest things that you can do. Have you heard of seed cycling before?
I think I have, yeah.
Yeah, so this is things like flax seeds and pumpkin seeds are very good building blocks of estrogen. So, by adding a tablespoon of mixed seeds to anything that you're eating, in a soup or a salad or a smoothie or what have you, just a tablespoon of seeds a day is going to give you those omegas and building blocks to help estrogen. And in the back end of the cycle, sunflower seeds and sesame seeds are seeds that support the production of progesterone. So actually, anyone who comes in to see me for fertility or PCOS or irregular periods and things like this, just adding in some seed cycling can be useful in conjunction with all the other things that we do. And I think importantly, especially to produce foods like progesterone, the body is craving complex carbohydrates to produce progesterone. This is always why we get those cravings, those sugar cravings, the week before the period, is because actually the body's asking you for complex carbohydrates so that it can make progesterone. So these are foods like your sweet potatoes, butternut squash, some of those root vegetables that are a little bit more starchy. These and tropical fruits, these are foods that really support the production of progesterone. But when we're struggling sometimes with weight at the same time, people are always trying to bring down those carbohydrates in order to burn fat, but that is just dangerous because then you're not giving your body the building blocks it needs for its hormones. So it's very tricky, this whole thing, to try and understand what's your ultimate goal And how can you still get that goal whilst balancing your hormones?
Yeah.
And remaining mentally stable so that you could cope with the stresses of life. It's entirely possible, but this is why it's really important to work with someone to guide you through it, because there's a lot to think about and a lot of links to make. But once you get those links, it is completely possible to do. Yeah.
Yeah, and something that might be difficult at first, but once you're into the swing of it and you know what foods to eat at which time of the month and whatever, then it can make a huge difference, can't it?
Yeah.
So during those three key stages of life, is one of the three key hormones more important than others, or are all three just key at all stages of a woman's life?
Well, personally, I think all three are key. I'm always doing something to either keep my progesterone up and keep my estrogen in balance, and trying to boost my testosterone as well, because testosterone is our sex hormone, is our strength hormone, and we really only get a surge of it when we're ovulating. Testosterone comes up over here, but testosterone is just as important for women as it is for men. And we all want to feel sexy and strong as well. So I think anything that we can do, but this is where it's also a trade-off with cortisol, which we're going to touch on, because a lot of these hormones, whilst we are cycling in our reproductive years, they're being produced by the ovaries. But what happens as we go into the perimenopause and menopause years, as the ovaries start to retire, they are handing that job over to our adrenal gland. And our adrenal gland is also the gland that will produce estrogen and testosterone, but it also produces cortisol, which is our stress hormone, but it's also the hormone that wakes us up and makes us feel alert.
Yeah.
And what happens with the adrenal gland is it's pumping out these adaptogens that can either be made into estrogen, testosterone, and cortisol. And if your cortisol is up because you're stressed physically, emotionally, or mentally, then that's going to bring those other hormones down.
Interesting. Yeah, because I'm always a high energy person, and have difficulty going to sleep, and and I know I have high cortisol levels, so maybe I should be doing something about that. Okay, so getting out these hormones all in balance is really key for optimal health and happiness. So let's look more closely in this episode at insulin. It's obviously key for men and women, but what is insulin?
So insulin, I call the queen. This is where, what I'm about to tell you might not be scientifically on point, but it's a visual that I explain to really bring it to life so that people can get it. Insulin is the most important hormone to get right, in my opinion, because this is what insulin does. Every time we eat any food at all, whether it's a protein, a carb, a fat, all food obviously is chewed in the mouth. It goes into the stomach where it's going to mix with acid and enzymes. And then it goes into the small intestine and squeezes out all of the nutrition. Now, what it squeezes out is vitamins, minerals, water, fatty acids, proteins, but all food will break into glucose, which is our fuel. Now, it's insulin that, if it's working properly, regulates our glucose. So insulin regulates our energy. So glucose from food is also our blood sugar. So those words are interchangeable, blood sugar and glucose. And as soon as glucose is detected in our bloodstream, there's a hormonal response, a trigger, if it's working as it should. And it's the pancreas that is in control of releasing insulin. And insulin's first job is to go and pull glucose out of the blood so that you are not left with high blood sugar, which would lead to, bacterial infections, diabetes, all these kinds of things. So its first job is to pull the sugar out of the blood. Insulin's second job is to take that glucose, that fuel, and deliver it to every single cell, muscle, and organ in your body for energy. So we're made up of tons of cells. They all have an energy center, and it's insulin that is the key holder to open that door and put the energy in. Now, if that energy is not getting into the cells are not going to work. So, with the example of thyroid, where there's so many people with thyroid conditions, you might have a Ferrari as an organ, but if there's not petrol in the tank, it is not going to work. And this is the problem. This is our modern day problem with our diet and lifestyle, is that because of the way that we are eating, because of the frequency of eating, because of the types of foods of eating, we are really messing up this insulin response. And what I mean by that is, does that make sense, first of all?
Yeah,
what I've said?
yeah, that does make sense.
Yeah. So what is happening is, if we are eating foods in a way that are pushing our blood sugar up too high and too quickly, the response from insulin, if you imagine a person like you and me, and we're overwhelmed with the amount of work that we have to do, then we start to prioritize if we can't cope. So if we have foods that we're pushing up our blood sugar super high and super quickly, insulin's response is, oh my God, that's a lot. I'm not sure I can cope with that much energy. Let me get some help. And it will call more insulin. Now, insulin is a hormone which is a fat-storing, steroid-building hormone. So if you are trying to lose weight, you do not want insulin to be raised. All the time that insulin is raised, you are fat storing and unable to fat burn. If you have any kind of inflammation, chronic disease, if you have cancer cells and you have raised insulin, they will be growing. So insulin's like this really important hormone that we need to get the energy and drive it into all the cells. It's got to be working for us. But if we overload it to the point that it can't cope, it just panics and raises, and it almost stops working. Yeah. So in the case of diabetes, if you keep pushing up that blood sugar, eventually it'll just say, oh my God, I can't keep up with you. You're on your own. And then you're left with high blood sugar. If you are eating frequently and eating foods that push your blood sugar up too high, again, what is happening is insulin is en masse grabbing the sugar out of the blood. It's too much for insulin to take around the body, so it will instantly convert that glucose into fat and put it in the fat store to be used later. And then it will go off and deliver the energy around the body. So this is how we start storing fat, and how we start messing with our insulin response, is by eating foods that are pushing up our blood sugar too high too quickly, and eating frequently. Because if we are eating frequently, you're not giving insulin enough time to deliver the energy.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, you're not giving it time to recover and prepare for the next meal. No, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So it's by that process, it's regulating the body. It's regulating the amount of energy that goes to the cells and everything else.
Completely. So, when we talk about inflammation and fat and weight gain and this kind of thing, all fat is energy which has come into the body, and for one reason and another, it has not been driven into the cells and been used as fuel. Yeah. And so energy for the body is like money for you and me. If we've got 10 pounds and we only spend 5, we don't throw the other 5 away. It's precious. We keep it for tomorrow. And the body does that with energy. Unfortunately, we don't just wee and poo it out. Energy that is not utilized is then put in the fat cells. So, and this is kind of where the calories in, calories out equation always comes in. In order to burn fat and therefore lose weight, we have to be in a calorie deficit. But actually, this is not always the case for some people. If your energy regulation system is broken, because we have overworked and overloaded insulin, and insulin's just like, I can't keep up. I'm sorry, I'm just going to have a rest. Then sometimes you could be eating, 1,000 calories only. But instead of that energy coming into the body, insulin grabbing it and delivering it around all those cells so that you are functioning, and then you're burning your fat cells. We can talk about that in a second. Instead, if insulin is not working properly, it takes that 1,000 calories and just holds on to it. And what happens is then, you end up in a situation where you're gaining weight, the fat stores are increasing. And because that energy is not being driven around to all those cells in the body, you're not functioning very well either. So you're tired, and now we have symptoms to show up. And so this is often the case with reproductive health. A lot of the hormone centers take strain here because your body starts to prioritize. It'll say, okay, I can't get around all the cells today, so which ones are more important? And your body, Jill, will be different to my body. We're all different, and our bodies will prioritize. And it might say, okay, look, we need some energy up to the brain, to the liver, to the heart, some of these essential organs. But thyroid, can you wait a bit? Ovaries, the last thing in terms of prioritizing, you just want to survive. Your body's not thinking about making babies and reproducing. So and they call this condition insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is actually the root cause of 90% of our man-made chronic illness and disease. Insulin resistance is the start of cardiovascular health going off. It's weight gain and obesity. It's diabetes, but it's also all of the mental health conditions. This is Alzheimer's and dementia, and ADHD, anxiety, depression. This whole relationship between blood sugar spikes and insulin response is the root cause to all of it. And that is, actually, I've got this book here. If anyone likes reading, there's a fascinating book called Why We Get Sick by someone called Benjamin Bickman. And he talks about insulin resistance. What is it? It's quite scientific, this book, but it's fascinating read if you're interested in learning more.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely fascinating. We are running out of time, and I just want to check. We now know some of the things that happen when the blood sugar level isn't regulated, and we do hear of all these things. I mean, cancer, all of these things can be affected by insulin in the body. How can we regulate it?
So because the insulin is released by the pancreas automatically in the body, it's very difficult for us to, we can't just kind of tell it what to do from the outside. But because it should be directly correlated to your blood sugar, we can influence insulin by controlling what we eat and the way that we eat it. And actually learning to eat in a way that brings food into the body in a way that releases the glucose from the food slowly over time, is the number one step that we can make. And there's a lot of research on this lately from someone called she calls herself the glucose goddess on Instagram and Facebook. Actually, I'm giving you lots of books to read, but here's another one. She wrote this book called The Glucose Revolution.
Okay.
And she has a lot of good hacks, because what she proved is, you know, the carbohydrate family will always get the bad rap in terms of sugars because they have the most sugar. So obviously this includes table sugar and cakes and chocolates and all these kinds of things. It also includes your carbohydrates, like the starchy carbohydrates, your bread, your rice and pasta. These are not sugars, but as soon as they hit your stomach acid, they will break into sugar and so push your blood sugar up quite quickly. Whereas something like your fats, your avocados and your proteins, these are very low sugar foods. And so when we eat them, it will take a lot longer for those sugars to get into the blood. But the work of this lady says if you eat your foods in this order, so sometimes it's not always about what we eat, but sometimes the order in which we eat it. If you eat your vegetables first, you are going to line your gut with fiber, which can create another layer in the gut, so that anything that you eat after that has to get through that layer before it can be released into the bloodstream. So, you know, given the choice, if you've got a plate where you've got meat, potatoes and vegetables, you know, if you eat your veggies first, then your meat, then your starchy carbohydrates last, just by changing the order in which you eat will slow down the release of sugar into your blood. Whereas the same meal, same calories, eaten the other way round, you know, the potatoes first, those starchy carbs can push your blood sugar up. And now you've got an energy problem where insulin's panicking and putting that energy into the fat store instead of being able to cope with driving it around the cells.
Yeah. And what do we do when we go out for a meal? Bread is put on the table and it's the first thing that you start eating. It's fascinating, isn't it? What do most people have for breakfast? They have a starchy breakfast. They either have toast or cereals, which should be banned anyway because of the full of sugar in it and horrible things that are in them. But yeah, people should start the day with a green smoothie, even, you know, something that will get into their gut. But we can talk more about that in our next episode. Because we're running out of time. And you know what? This has been absolutely fascinating, Karen. I've worked with many nutritionists over my many years of life. And I think I've done quite, you know, I'm 65, I'm always full of energy, I'm generally very healthy. So I think I've done well, but I've never heard it put in this way. And I'm finding this absolutely fascinating. So I can't wait to continue, but we are going to end for today. I'd just say to all the people listening, look out for episode 47, which will be the second one in this mini series. And we're going to be talking about either cortisol or estrogen, but we're going to carry on with this so that you understand more and more about how those hormones are affecting your body and what you can do about it to help yourself have more energy, better sleep, and generally a healthier and happier life. Karen, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thanks for having me, Jill. It's always a pleasure.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you. Thanks so much for listening to this week's show. Check out all the links to the resources mentioned in today's episode and all my freebies in the show notes. See you next time.